Welcome to this presentation on epistemic practices, a core component of teacher practice. Before we dive into this, I would like to provide some terms that I would be using throughout this presentation when describing the various examples of epistemic practices. Here we have some common language for teacher, anti-racist teaching practice, and critical thinking. Here, teacher is a trustworthy content expert whose intentionality and integrity of practice facilitates learning. Trustworthiness implies that through the teacher's practice, children consistently achieve the expected learning outcomes, and there is a connection between what the teacher is doing and what the students are learning. Teacher integrity means that the teacher knows about learning and their beliefs about learners, and schooling allows them to choose appropriate practices to use for individual, small group, and whole classrooms of learners. And of course, integrity means you teach like you mean it. For anti-racist teaching, I took the definition of anti-racism from Dr. Kendi and grounded it in Dr. Hollins's definition of teacher practice. And so an anti-racist teaching practice is planning for, enacting, and interpreting and translating student learning outcomes that reliably produce epistemic, intellectual, and creative agencies that power students to pursue the professional endeavors of their choosing. What is unique about this particular definition is that I'm not discussing closing gaps between groups of children because according to recent National Assessment of Educational Progress data, there is not one demographic of students who are not over 50% proficient in literacy or math. So what we want to do is develop teacher practice that gets all students proficient enough to take on real-life professional roles in their communities. And we really want to focus on the students that we miseducate the most, and that tends to be African American and Latino students. Critical thinking, then, is using one's knowledge in order to develop literacy. So when you think of critical thinking, this is when individuals elaborate or restructure their current understanding in order to apply knowledge in novel, diverse, and authentic contexts. They're able to explain ideas, interpret text, and then predict phenomenon, and then construct arguments based on evidence. Because literacy is the ability to apply knowledge in novel, diverse, and authentic contexts, constructing these arguments based on evidence is what or being able to construct arguments based on evidence is how we're going to be measuring student learning and their ability to critically think. This was taken from Mark Winchell's work on social constructivism. So, epistemic practices are discipline-specific routines that engage students in critical thinking. I want to be very clear here. I'm not talking about warm-ups, routines, or using whiteboards, thumbs up, thumbs down, or other classroom or academic routines. I'm talking about routine processes that individuals who are members of the profession, the subject matter represents, what they engage in when they call themselves historians or scientists. This means if I'm teaching biologist, that I'm teaching an experimentation process. And I use that experimentation process as pedagogy, as a theory of practice. The experimentation process is well defined, it's taught explicitly, and is used over time with the intention of students using the practices without being prompted. In other words, the skills themselves are the learning goal. I use it across topics and units, and from using the process across diverse and authentic contexts, students are given the opportunity to develop the habits of mind to solve problems using these methods. So let's take a look at some of the examples in the different subject matters. Literacy or language art. I would like to point out that all of the examples that are going to be presented in this presentation were co-constructed with pre-service candidates who have degrees within the subject matter. They were asked to describe a common task or process used to address a particular standard or learning goal. Language arts provided analyzing literary devices. This process includes basically 3 steps. Step 1, you identify the plot of what you're reading. And then you ask questions of the reading. So you annotate the questions that you have about it. And then you identify or differentiate the literary device that's being used in the passage. So an example of a literary device includes things like irony or the theme or the purpose. Now, I asked anytime students needed to analyze a theme or purpose of a piece of literature in order to get deeper into a passage. I asked my candidates, could they use this process with anything? And they said yes. And I said, that's what makes it epistemic, right? You have to be able to define the process. You have to give it a name, and you use that name whenever you assign the process. You have to teach it explicitly like a lesson all by itself. And then whenever you assign an analysis, you have them go through this process. And eventually, what students will do is they're capable and able to read in the instructions, analyze the plot of the story, and basically cue themselves to know that, okay, so I'm going to be using this process, and will know exactly what to do. So I'm hoping that makes a little sense there. Here's the math example, and it is taught in the same way. The only things that are different here is that the steps are unique to the subject matter and the math content itself, but here it is. So the first thing, and this was really special because we were the candidates and I were really co-constructing this kind of idea because it's so new. People don't think about the subject matter being the pedagogy, right? And then purposely, intentionally using that subject matter over a period of time so that the candidates or the students themselves can be self-regulatory, and that's one of the goals. But we articulated what it meant to identify a problem because we give kids problems so much. So we assign them problems, but we don't take everyday experiences and say, identify a problem that you can solve in this everyday experience. And so in mathematical terms, this means you identify what the phenomenon or the scenario is, and then you determine all the variables needed for the scenario to make sense, and determine if all of them are present. And then you identify the variables that are missing, and then you state the problem and the nature of the math function used to solve the problem. And so I'm not a mathematician, but I played with this identifying the problem, and then the next one that we're going to be looking at, I went to like Khan Academy and I said, what is the relationship between variables and the types of equations that you use to solve them? And that's an actual thing. So this identifying a problem process for me, not being a mathematician, led me to ask, what are the relationships between the variables that allow me to identify the kind of math I want to do? And that's getting into the epistemology of mathematics. So this process has a lot of validity to it. Slide 6 is once you identify your problem, now you want to solve it. So here's another one for math. Once you understand what the problem is, given the information and the end goal, you choose the kind of math that you're doing, and then you devise multiple plans to solve the problem. You carry out a plan, and if that plan doesn't work, you go back to the last step, and you pick plan B, and you figure out a plan based on what you understand about mathematics until you find a plan of action. And that means the kind of, if you're in a particular subject matter of math and a topic within that subject matter, and then what you do is you devise different ways of setting up problems. And like I said, I'm not a math teacher, I'm a science teacher. But I would always have the kids come up with 3 plans and test the plans, and then you'll start to see the relationship between the kind of problem that you're solving and the plan that matches that problem. So it'll start getting self-regulatory. And then once you're done with all that jazz, you look back and you check the solutions. Even physical education has an epistemic practice. It has 2, actually. We have 2 examples here. The first one is the demonstration. When you're teaching a new sport or you're teaching a new movement, the teacher demonstrates and explains what to do. And so you provide students, first of all, you demonstrate the movement, then you explain and teach the technique, and then you have them practice. So you show them how to do it, then the whole group does it, and then small groups do it, and then individual students do it. And then have the students demonstrate once they've gone through the practice, and then you can have them self-evaluate and assess what they're doing, and then reteach as needed. Now, I didn't quite understand what this was at first. Transfer. So this is when once the kids have mastered a particular practice, you then ask them where and when and how much they're going to do this movement. So you have students answer the question where they would do this activity, have students think about when they would do this activity and why they would do this activity. What's the benefits? So these 2 things go together. It's like this is more, a transfer is like a reflection, because you want to influence their lifestyle. You want students to grow into a healthy lifestyle and have some physical habits that will cut down on health issues later on in life. So I thought that was pretty good. Social science here uses primary sources. I'm always asking them to use primary sources. Give me a process for that, because that's all the social science I really know. So when teaching and using primary sources as a teaching tool, as an epistemic practice, you have students cite the evidence to justify the reasoning of the historical timeline. You use a secondary source to validate the primary source. You analyze the era for political, social, and economic consequences, and then you use interactives and technology to provide experiences constructing historical narratives. Right? So it's not just making maps and timelines. Maps and timelines are tools, right? The use of interactives and technology are tools embedded in a process. And sometimes what happens is that we focus on building the timeline or building the map, and we take it out of context. We don't connect that map to interpreting the primary source site, and then connecting the pieces of the timeline or the pieces of the map to secondary sources, and then being able to use that map to analyze political, social, and economic consequences. If the first three parts aren't there and you're just having them draw a map or a timeline, or just discussing a particular historical error in time, then you're not creating historically literate people. You're, basically just engaging in a historical conversation. So we know where that leads to when people are not historically literate in our day and age. Okay, so this is my area. I'm a scientist. And in here, we use the example of guided inquiry as an epistemic practice. And so what I would do when I was in the classroom, if this was going to be my epistemic practice, I would have made a whole lesson around just learning this practice. And so I would have given them a very easy inquiry activity to do, something that they were very familiar with. And then I would have taught them each step. You're going to make observations. You're going to identify the unknowns. You're going to come up with reasoning based on your observation of what you think the unknowns are. You're going to make a claim. Then you're going to check your reasoning against what is known about the phenomenon. So this is where I would have them analyze text and maybe look at a video, or maybe even do an experiment, and then collect some data. And then once you have had those experiences, you revise your reasoning until the claim can explain all the unknowns. And so this process would be used all year long. And I would encourage my colleagues to use this process in the chemistry, because I taught biology, chemistry, and physics, so that the kids would get 3 years of doing this practice. And that's what really drives home the habit of mind. Our last example comes from world language, and this is facilitating conversations. And so step 1, you engage in your first language. Step 2, you translate conversation in the target language. Step 3, you practice conversations in the target language, and then you use the conversation in a real world context, and then you refine what you know. So this is basically facilitating conversations. So what does this look like in a lesson plan? I'm going to use the world language example because that was the last one. So for world language, I'm using the 5E lesson cycle form. You'll see the 5Es represented, and they're embedded in this very kind of simplistic lesson plan. The 5Es are engagement, explore, explain, extend, and evaluate. So that's used to guide, how you're going to increase the rigor of the activity as you're planning it, right? You will also see the components of the epistemic practice that was just introduced in the last slide too, right? You're having students engage in their home language first as an informal assessment. The engagement is when the students are talking to each other in that language. And then the explorers, when they translate the conversation into the target language. The explain, students share their conversations in Spanish with fellow peers, and the teacher. Extend, you create a skit and you use the translated version in the real world. So what we did here was we used the epistemic practice, but we made it fit a real classroom example, right? So if you're using this, if you're a world language teacher and you're using this, you've already taught the process. So students should be able to see the process and what they're doing. And if they don't, you explicitly point it out. That's the teaching. Okay. So here we are. Lastly, we want to relate this to the theme of the professional development, which is healthy classroom connections. And I made it an emphasis on trustworthiness. You got to learn your students and earn their trust. Students trust that you know what you are doing when you know how knowledge is built in the subject matter and can teach it. When you know your epistemic practices and you're explicitly teaching them to students, you build in the trustworthiness that we talked about at the beginning, where trustworthiness implies that through the teacher's practice, children consistently achieve the expected learning outcomes. And there's a connection between what the teacher is doing, the epistemic practice, and what the students are learning, which is the skill and the content. Right? So there's a connection there. Knowing your epistemic practice and subject matter are extremely important. So the goal is to have students able to choose an approach to a problem once they've mastered different approaches. They get to pick what's the best way to get from point A to point B in problem solving. It's intellectual self-regulation and cueing. And what I mean by that is so I would teach my 4 basic epistemic practices in biology the first month of school and have them try it out. And then I would assign these practices weekly whenever we had a new topic, or if we were engaging in experimentation, if we were having to create an argument. So in my head, by November, all the students should be versed in the practices. That I should be able to say, basically what they would do is they would see that I would have assigned a laboratory activity for the week, depending on the topic. And the kids would know I got to ask questions. I got to talk about what I already know. I have to develop a hypothesis. And from that hypothesis, I have to rearrange the protocol so that I can actually measure what my hypothesis is. By November, the students were able to do and say those things. And what we were grappling with was when they would get stuck on a hypothesis, or they couldn't really figure out how to manipulate the protocol to test the hypothesis. But they understood the relationship between what scientific information they knew, what questions they were asking, and how to form a hypothesis consistently. And my goal by April was to have the kids know and have mastered the skill that they could teach someone else. And so that's what I mean by intellectual self-regulation, that I'm not teaching how to learn or how to engage and negotiate the content. I'm just teaching the content. And then lastly, it provides a way to structure your lesson plans, right? So if you have a learning cycle, and there's many kinds of learning cycles out there. I like the 5E because it's easy for me. But if you provide a way to structure your lessons, then you know what you're going to do first. You know what you're going to have to spend more time with. Or let's just go back to the primary sources. So you're going to be citing the evidence to justify the reasoning of that time period. If I'm building a unit, I may spend a couple of days just presenting the sources, because that's the first thing in my epistemic practice. And that's going to lead them into searching for all the secondary evidence that supports the primary sources. And the kids are going to be building an argument. That may take, 2 or 3 extra days. And then they're going to make a claim. And I can build a whole lesson around them making a claim about their argument. And maybe have them do some debates or have them write something. And then they're going to, check their reasoning and then build something or produce a product. So I've gone through the epistemic practice of using primary sources, but I'm also building a lesson or a unit as well. So my lesson has cognitive integrity. My lesson has epistemic integrity. And I know the kids are going to learn something because it's following, the principles of learning. So remember that integrity means that the teacher knows about learning, and they also are very aware of their beliefs about what students can do. And They choose appropriate practices to use for individual, small group, and whole classrooms of learners. So when we talk about that integrity, we want to use things that our profession provides us when we're constructing those lessons. So this was my presentation on epistemic practices. I'm looking forward to seeing your faces soon, and I hope this was very helpful.